All right, my time says 11 Central, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to our fourth webinar in the Midday Master Beef webinar series. If you haven't been on before, my name is Courtney Bridges. I'm the Beef Programs Coordinator for UT and also one of the hosts for this Midday Master Beef webinar series. So as always, we really appreciate you joining us in the middle of your day. Just a refresher, if you want to ask any content related questions, please do so in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And after Dr. Jones gets done with his presentation, I will ask him questions that you send in the Q&A. Yeah, so we have a guest speaker today joining us from the University of Georgia. Dr. Jones is the extension veterinarian at UGA. And I heard a vaccination presentation that he gave sometime in the past. And I said, our Tennessee beef producers really need to hear this information. So we're very excited to have him speak today. We really appreciate you taking the time to do so, Dr. Jones. I know that your schedule is really busy. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Courtney. I appreciate that. And it's a privilege. It's an honor to be invited to be part of your Master Beef program. And I really appreciate that. Am I coming through clear and screens visible? We're good to go.
Just share your screen again. I think I popped it earlier.
All right. So with that, thank you. And this is a topic that we get a lot of questions about. What kind of vaccines do I need to use? And then there's a lot of information out there that possibly our vaccination strategies could be actually causing problems. So we want to balance immunity and fertility. I do want to mention to everybody that I'm part of the Beef Reproductive Task Force, beefrepro.org. Go to that. You can see our Facebook page. We have a YouTube channel, has a lot of different material on it, resources for cattlemen, and there is some Twitter. I don't tweet, but we do have people that monitor our Twitter account. But look up beefrepro.org and check out those resources on there. So I do want to make a quick plug for the Reproductive Task Force. So fertility for a cow-calf operation is job one. It's the very first priority. But if I don't wean a calf, it really doesn't matter if I get cows pregnant or if they calve. If I don't wean that calf, reproduction did not occur. We don't get points for getting close. We don't get any income for getting close. We only get income when calves are weaned and then calves are sold. So it's also important to understand as cattle owners, even though reproductive efficiency is our highest priority, for that cow, fertility is a luxury. And we need to understand that. And a lot of things come before pregnancy, become before lactation. So any management activity or production recommendation that might have a negative impact on fertility needs to be carefully scrutinized. In fact, I recommend that all practices on a farm need to be reviewed regularly and just look at that cost benefit analysis. So and make sure that it passes the muster, right? It needs to make sure that animal health, animal reproduction, and the economics of it. So I need to make sure that it passes all three, that it's going to improve health, improve reproduction, but do so economically. So all practices need to be reviewed on a regular basis. All of our herd health goals for a cow-calf operation need to have fertility in mind. The goal of every herd health program has to be to protect as well as improve the fertility of our cow herd. Hippocrates said well over 2,000 years ago that all disease begins in the gut. And I would modify his statement. I totally agree with that statement. I would modify that statement and say that all fertility and all health also begins in the gut. So nutrition is critical. The environment is very important. What kind of diseases or challenges or stressors are my herd exposed to? Is my herd exposed to? So I may have a great fertility or I may have a great vaccination program, but any exposure can overwhelm vaccine protection. When I look at reproductive efficiency, I need to look at the body condition of my cow herd, make sure my bulls are up for the task or synchronization program. So make sure that I've got the male side covered through breeding soundness evaluations. And then I need to select heifers, both for fertility and longevity. And then I need to prevent infectious diseases. Maybe I should have brought this one up as number one, but biosecurity is the most important protection or barrier to disease or any kind of challenge to my herd. So I need to have a good biosecurity program. And then my disease resistance is a combination of good nutrition program and a vaccination program. I don't have disease resistance without good nutrition. So why do we use vaccines in our beef herds? Obviously, we're looking to protect our cow herd fertility. And this is not just the herd, but the individual. So the individual can be protected through direct protection, through prevention program with our vaccines, but they're also protected because of the barrier of the herd. If an individual is vaccinated but still naive, didn't respond to that vaccine, they're still at risk. But if all the animals around it are protected, then a disease is not going to spread through that herd like it would through a herd who has no herd immunity. Then we're going to vaccinate to enhance colostrum quality. And that's going to improve the passive immunity in our calves. And that's the very first immunity that we have in the first 60, possibly 90 days of birth, after birth or their life. So if I vaccinate cows and I increase antibody production, those antibodies are going to be sequestered into the colostrum. The calf's going to nurse that cow within a couple of hours of being born, and then the antibodies are going to be absorbed and go through the calf's system, and that's going to be primary protection. Then calf vaccination program is going to increase resistance to calfhood diseases. The first two that come to mind there is summer pneumonia, as well as the clostridial diseases like blackleg or enterotoxemia. So I want to make sure that my calves are adequately protected. And I can do that in the face of maternal immunity. I just need to be very strategic about how I do that. And then I'm going to be, as I'm vaccinating my calves, I'm going to be increasing or building the foundation of immunity for future replacement cattle. This starts at the very beginning. When I vaccinate calves at branding time or pre-weaning, I'm building the immunity in my replacement heifers. And I really want to make sure that I take advantage of that, because this is going to build a great foundation for the future of my cow herd protection, my cow herd immunity. And then this is also, most people think in terms of vaccinating to optimize marketing opportunities. How I vaccinate my cows determines how I can vaccinate my calves, because we have to deal with those things called labels, and they're a good vaccination program in my cow herd gives me more options and more flexibility in how I can vaccinate my calves. And there's a lot of evidence that shows that vaccinating calves, feeder calves, 2 rounds of modified live, those calves have more value, and many people capture that value. If you're not capturing the value through your marketing options, then I certainly recommend that you investigate other marketing opportunities, because there is value there and those calves are worth more. And we should be going into a great cattle market season over the next few years, according to all the things that I've read. And then again, I'm just going to re-emphasize this, that nutrition and biosecurity are the first and second tier of protection. So if I don't have those two, then vaccinating is, and I'm relying on vaccination, then I'm going to be very disappointed with my vaccination program. When we talk about vaccines, we talk about respiratory and reproductive typically. So I want to break this down and look mostly at our reproductive vaccines. And the viruses that come to mind from a reproductive or have an impact on the reproduction include bovine viral diarrhea virus that can cause infertility, direct infertility or conception failure. It can cause abortion. It can cause persistently infected calves, which are going to be a source of transmission and recirculation of BVD virus in my herd. Or it can cause congenital defects like cerebellar aplasia. And these calves are typically born alive and otherwise healthy, but they just can't stand. They lack the coordination because part of the brain was affected with BVD and did not develop. So these calves, there's no treatment for these calves, and these calves will have to be euthanized. The other virus that has direct impact on reproduction in our cow herd is bovine herpes virus, also known as infectious bovine rhinotracheitis, or IBR. And this can cause infertility as well, and abortions. Then we include the leptospira serovars, Harjo-bovis, Pomona, Gryptotyphosa, Icterohemorrhagiae, and Canicola. That's the L5 component in our vaccine. So you'll get a virus, which may be a 5-way plus the L5. And some of those vaccines also contain Campylobacter fetus, or Vibrio. Vibrio is a sexually transmitted that cows get from infected bulls. And this is where biosecurity is very important. If I only buy virgin bulls from reputable herds, then I'm not going to introduce Vibrio into my cow herd, because virgin bulls are not infected with Vibrio. And if they come to my herd, there's no source of Vibrio. But if I am buying used bulls that have been in other herds and cleaned up, then there is a risk of introducing Vibrio. But this is also, so some vaccines don't include Vibrio. And if I don't need it because I don't have the risk factors associated with acquiring Vibrio, then it may not necessarily be part of my vaccination program. So we use vaccines to stimulate the immune system and to train it to recognize and respond quickly to common disease pathogens or toxins, toxins being things that are produced like from our Clostridial bacteria, like enterotoxemia. And then we understand that vaccines will target the adaptive, or what we call the acquired immune part of the immune system. And that has two components, and that's the cell-mediated immunity, and this is killer T lymphocytes, or the humoral immunity. And this is the antibody production. Typically, we think that modified live viral vaccines target and stimulate the cell-mediated immunity, and our killed viral vaccines stimulate the humoral immunity. Our toxin vaccines can also stimulate antibody production too. There is some overlap between this, depending on how the vaccines, their adjuvants, and adjuvants are additive products in there to help stimulate or enhance the immune response. And I'll talk briefly about that in a second. The innate or the natural immune system, that's the general immune system, is absolutely essential to stimulation of the adaptive system. And if the immune system, the innate immunity isn't working because of poor nutrition, I'm not going to get a vaccine response. So the innate system function depends on health and the nutrition of the animal. And this is very simple, but it's an important concept that we all need to remember, is that the animals make the vaccine work. And vaccines only work in healthy animals. So when we look at the studies done, then we understand that vaccines were tested in animals that are healthy, and they don't work in animals that are diseased or animals that are in poor body condition because of challenged nutrition. So if we look at our killed virus vaccine, they contain an inactivated or a killed virus. The virus does not replicate in the body. Each dose contains a lot of antigen. And so if you want to remember antigen, anything that generates an antibody response, that's the antigen. And that's the old definition. Antigen actually also generates a cell-mediated response, but the old definition was something that generated antibody. So the antigen is what the immune system reacts to. And there's an adjuvant. And that adjuvant is an ingredient in our vaccine that helps enhance or stimulate the immune response to improve that response. And it does require a primary and a booster dose. And this is absolutely essential. If I vaccinate cattle with only one dose, and that's all they've ever seen, then I don't have protected cattle. Look at this chart. The primary dose, we get a primary response, and that takes a long time to occur, at least 2 weeks. Sometimes longer, depending on our antigen. And then we come in with our second dose, typically sometime around 3 to 4 weeks later. And you can see that our second response is much higher. This is called the anamnestic response. Anamnestic means no amnesia, or the memory response. And so our secondary is going to be a faster response. It's going to be a larger response. And this is essential to building the immune response with our killed virus vaccines. I'll talk a bit more about killed here in just a second. And these are also very safe. We don't hear about a vaccine response to our killed virus vaccines because they don't have the same risk factors and effects that a modified live. So when we talk about a modified live virus, and that's the viruses PI3, IBR, BRSV, BVD 1 and 2, that's a live virus that in fact replicates in the animal. It mimics a viral infection that way. And so when I give this vaccine, the virus goes into the body and it replicates. And because it replicates or multiplies, that's what stimulates the immune response. And it's also important that I handle this correctly because it has a lower antigen dose in this vaccine. And then that multiplies and builds that dose, if you will, in the body. But because there's a very, very low dose, this mishandling of modified live viral vaccines can actually kill the virus. Because it's a very low dose, then it doesn't act like a killed viral vaccine. It just is ineffective. So this is very important that we handle these correctly. The modified live viral vaccines stimulate a quicker, longer, and stronger immunity than the killed virus vaccines. So that's why a lot of people recommend using a modified live, especially in calves and in stocker cattle. It can stimulate immunity in one dose. Revaccination is needed to help cattle respond, more cattle that didn't respond the first time. If an animal responds to the modified live, it doesn't need a booster. Okay, a second modified live does not booster that response. That response is efficient the first time, but the problem is we don't know which cattle responded and which cattle don't. And then as far as the safety, understand that modified live virus vaccines, specifically the IBR or the bovine herpes virus component, actually can cause abortion if we use them in pregnant, naive cows. So a vaccine response. Typically we think that when we vaccinate cattle, we get 100% response and we get a very average response. Okay, that's not the case at all. What we think we get, what we really get are two very, very different things. We get some animals that have a tremendous response, way over the top, and these animals are very, very well protected. We get some animals that have an average response. And then we get some animals that have a below average response. And then we get a percentage of animals and how the health of these animals and the nutrition of these animals determines the percentage. We actually get a handful of animals that never do respond. Because whatever reason, their immune system is preoccupied, it's distracted, or it's not working properly, but it does not recognize the vaccine. And then the other thing is that we need to think about when I'm giving all those vaccines, I don't know if you've counted up the number of antigens that we give. We give a 5-way and a 7-way. I mean, we're giving 12 right there. I get a variable response to each and every one of those. So it's very unlikely that I'm going to get an animal that looks like this to all 12 or more of those individual vaccines. So a vaccination program is really important that we make sure we do our due diligence and manage those cattle correctly so that we get the response we're expecting or the response that those cattle need. So why don't vaccines work? Well, vaccines do work if we follow label directions and we vaccinate healthy cattle that are on a good nutrition program. The vaccine efficacy is tested in healthy animals. How about vaccine efficiency? And that's how vaccine efficiency is how it works in my herd. And there's 3 very important parts in vaccine efficiency. And that's the vaccines that I'm using, the animals that they're given to, and the people giving the vaccine. So the vaccines, were they stored correctly? Were they transported correctly? Were they handled and administered correctly? Were they given at the right timing? What kind of things? So all the antigens are not equal. we see a big difference between IBR response and BVD response, and how many we give at the same time. This was an autogenous vaccine. This picture was an autogenous vaccine shipped to one of my clients, and it arrived at 60 degrees. Fortunately, it was killed, so it doesn't have the same impact as a modified live, but nevertheless, shipping and storage matters whether or not vaccines are going to actually work. And then the animals, are they healthy? Are they not diseased or not distressed or not parasitized or, not malnourished? All of these things are important, but make sure that I'm going to get a good vaccine response in my healthy animals. And then my people. It is absolutely essential that we train our people that work for us to handle these vaccines properly, handle our livestock properly. And they are typically the key with whether or not a vaccination program works. Just because I give a vaccine IC in the cow, in the calf, doesn't mean that I've got vaccinated animals. So I'm going to have to make sure that I'm going to administer that vaccination with the right equipment, procedures. And then not every animal that is vaccinated, even if I do everything right, not every animal is going to respond. So 100 response is not possible. We should never expect it, but we should do everything that we can possibly do to make sure that I have the maximum or the opportune response to my cow herd or my vaccination program. This is a study that was done by some of my colleagues up at Athens at the University of Georgia and the College of Veterinary Medicine, Dr. Palomares and his group. And it just looked at the effect of supplemental trace minerals. And we can supplement trace minerals either orally or injectable. There's some options, and minerals are very important, an important part of our immune response. And so Dr. Palomares and his group gave two groups of cattle. One group of cattle got the vaccine, and another group of cattle got the same vaccine, but they also got supplemental trace minerals. And what they found was that the animals that were only vaccinated without a good mineral program, only 53% of those cattle had a 4x antibody titer response. And that's the definition of an antibody response, is typically can we give it and see a 4x difference in antibody levels after 28 days of vaccination. So in that situation, we had a lot more cattle that responded with trace mineral. 80% of those cattle that had supplemented trace minerals responded. So this is really what we expect, and what we want is get a high percentage of animals. So our nutrition program is very important to our vaccine response, and that's the lesson of that study. Just even though it's not, just to let you know that this is also important in other species. In humans, someone did a study and they looked at older adults, and what they found was that adults that had adequate copper, phosphorus, and magnesium actually had a better response. And the the people that had higher zinc levels and phosphorus levels also had a higher response. So this is also, nutrition is just as important in human response to vaccine as it is in veterinary medicine. What about stress? Another one of my colleagues up in Athens, Dr. Cardile, and his researchers looked at stress effects of vaccine response. And so they looked at sale barn calves versus farm raised calves, and they vaccinated those calves, all received the same modified live. And they did look at the CMI, the cell mediated response, as a response of peripheral blood mononuclear cell stimulation, the PBMC. And what they found was that the stressed calves had a lower immune response as measured by that test. You can look here, the light gray bars are the stressed cattle, the dark gray bars are the lower stressed cattle. And you can see the herpes virus response was greatly affected. BVD response was also somewhat affected. And so, and the manhemia as well as the multocida. And so there was a significant difference in those calves and the amount of stress that those calves experienced, and then their vaccine response. So it's very important to understand that we need to manage the people need to manage their vaccine administration, and the nutrition and the animal handling to get the proper expected response to our vaccination program. So previously vaccinated cattle may not mean adequately vaccinated cattle. Part of my job is to work at a diagnostic lab. And I hear constantly farmers will tell me, well, we vaccinated. And then I find out a little bit later that maybe all of those criteria to get a best response from our vaccination program didn't happen. Okay. Animals that fail to respond to a vaccine, they're still naive. If they never responded, it's just like they never were vaccinated. And so those naive animals are still at risk. Not only are they at risk, but they're also a source of transmission. If I've got protection, those animals aren't going to be spreading disease. But if I have animals that are naive, they're going to get sick and they're going to multiply that disease bug, and then they're going to spread it to the other animals, and it's going to reduce my herd immunity. And so that percentage of naive animals that are vaccinated are also going to have a lower response and lower fertility. So when I started practice way back in the 90s in Nebraska, we used, in those days, we had a 4-way modified live. Today we have 5 because it includes BVD type 2. And we used that Vibrio lepto at preg check. And typically in the fall, we went out and preg checked and vaccinated cows. We used modified live in the calves at branding before the cows were turned out with the bull. And then we typically avoided the use of modified live in nursing pregnant cows because we were worried about shedding. In 2000s, there were reports about the improved response of modified lives, and there was a push to include modified lives in our cow herd vaccination program, including pregnant cows. Even though there were risks known about using modified live herpes virus on fertility and pregnancy, it was still became more popular to do that. And in fact, in 2003, the first modified live vaccine for use in pregnant cows was approved by the United States Department of Agriculture. The USDA is the one that monitors and regulates vaccine development and approval. So we know that modified live bovine herpes virus causes ovarian and luteal necrosis and inflammation, aneuphoreitis. We've known that for years. We also know that it reduces, because it causes luteal necrosis, it lowers progesterone levels, as well as reduces luteal function. And Dr. Perry and others have shown that it causes abnormal estrous cycles, reduced conceptions, and then a lot of diagnostic labs started reporting abortion in late trimester cows that were vaccinated with the modified live IBR. And there was a lot of reports that also showed a reduced conception rate to AI in previously vaccinated cows. And this was previously vaccinated cows, even when used according to the label. But there are benefits to using a modified live in our herd, right? So we've got to figure out a way to find that balance. So vaccinating, there's several reports here that I just want to share with you, just a little bit of a brief summary of some of these reports. And this is taken directly out of the results and discussion of these reports. Vaccinating naive cows against herpes virus, viral diarrhea, and lepto improved reproductive efficiency in dairy cattle. Vaccinating cows against these pathogens, particular both those administered before fixed timed AI, improved reproductive performance in Brazilian cow-calf systems. So not just US. Okay, in conclusion, abortion in BVD vaccinated cattle is decreased by 45%. Inactivated as well as modified live viral vaccines decrease abortion risk. This research, use of a modified live vaccine, did not impede reproduction. So this study showed that there was no reduced fertility. So we had protection and we had a minimal risk or zero risk. So we know that modified live virus vaccine can be handled and is essential part of a good vaccination program in our cow herds and our herd health program. But we do know that it can cause abortion. So several authors at the diagnostic lab, various diagnostic laboratories, including those in Wyoming, South Dakota, Colorado, have recognized an apparent increase in abortion after vaccination in the last 10 years. And remember that that vaccine was approved in 2003. So following that approval, saw an increase in the abortion rate after vaccination. But some other authors reported a decline in overall abortions due to bovine herpes virus or because of vaccination program. So when used appropriately, modified lives decrease the abortion risk. When used inappropriately, without a good background, without a good foundation, it actually increases abortion. And this is just this chart here on the bottom left shows abortion after vaccine. So this was actually used on label, and they actually had 4 abortions and 5 stillbirths in a week, and a weak calf. This was used off label. In other words, vaccinating cows that were not previously vaccinated had an 8% abortion risk. On label, 25% abortion risk. So we do know that there are other things that play into a role here. This was a dairy, this bottom right-hand graph was a dairy, and you can see all the abortions happen. Right here, where this arrow points down, is where the modified live virus vaccine, bovine herpes virus, was discontinued. And then you can see the significant reduction in abortions. So this would be a high stress environment where if I'm vaccinating, I can potentially increase the abortion risk and decrease my vaccine response. So we do know that these vaccines, when misused, can have a significant impact on our abortions, but when used appropriately, can actually protect our cow herd. Sorry about that. So what are the effects of pre-breeding modified live vaccines on fertility? Yeah, obviously, it's going to depend on the immune status. Are these animals naive? Are they immunocompromised? Or are they protected? So the response in all 3 of these groups of cattle are going to be very different. There are direct effects on the ovarian tissue, luteal tissues, and the follicles. And then the vaccine response requires a huge metabolic expense. The immune response consumes energy. The immune response consumes minerals. It consumes vitamins. It consumes protein. It consumes a lot of resources that are not going to be available. They're going to possibly be depleted, and they're not going to be available to the other functions of the animal. So if I got an animal that's of marginal status or even malnourished, they're not going to have the response, and then they're going to deplete nutrients that animal's going to need for lactation, for uterine involution, so it can get ready for the next pregnancy, or even reproductive function. This is also true of killed vaccines. It just depends on the level of stimulation by that killed vaccine. And it's important to understand that the elephant that's in the room is this is possibly vaccine related. Not all vaccines are the same. And so when we talk about modified lives, and as a general group, not all modified lives have the exact same strains of viruses in them. So some strains may have more impact, more risk, or less risk than others. And I'm not going to go into that on this webinar, but I think it's important to have that conversation with your veterinarian or with the person that makes your vaccine recommendations in your herd and find out, are there more or less risk associated with these vaccines, and then choose a vaccination program appropriately. So this one, it talks about, or just illustrates the fact, this is about trace minerals. One of my part-time jobs is to consult with multi-min, but this talks about the consumption of trace minerals. But this could be true of any of our nutrients. It could be true of carbohydrates, proteins, vitamins, trace minerals, all of our minerals. So if you look here, the status of where those animals are when I vaccinate is very important. If the animals are adequate or even have excess, then the drop in nutrients, that drop in curve is going to be very shallow, and it's going to be short-lived. But if these animals are deficient and I vaccinate them, it's going it's going to drive this curve deeper and longer. And these animals here at the bottom, even though it's a green line, nutrient deficiency, by the time they finally return back to adequate status, it's going to be late in the breeding season. And these animals are going to have very few or no opportunities to get pregnant. And so they're either going to show up late bred in my herds, which we know that costs us money, or they're going to show up completely open. And that costs us even more money. So it's very important that we understand that where the animals start and when we vaccinate our cows determines where they're going to end. And this is something that I need to manage. We have all of the tools, and I certainly recommend that all of our farmers discuss this with a veterinarian or a nutritionist to make sure that your animals are adequately protected at the beginning of the breeding season, and so that they're not actually going to be late in my season and may not breed at all. So this study, most of our farmers in the Southeast like to use killed vaccines. And if you read on Facebook and all of these different pages, people say that animals are vaccinated. And whenever I inquire a little bit more and what does vaccinated mean, I find out that sometimes they might have been given a single dose of a killed vaccine at some point in their life, and that is called vaccinated. Or they may not even have received a reproductive vaccine whatsoever. They might have gotten 7-way blackleg, and that's all. And they're represented as vaccinated. So if farmers only use killed vaccines, what kind of protection? So this study was done at Auburn by Dr. Walls and his colleagues there at Auburn, and they did a great study here. And they looked at 3 of the common popular killed vaccines, inactivated BVD vaccines. And they administered 2 doses. Some people don't administer both. They only administer 1, but they did administer 2 doses at 0 and 21 days. And then they looked at antibody levels, and then they challenged them. They actually put BVD infected PI animals into those herds, and they looked at the reaction, or they looked at the protection or the lack of protection in those vaccinated herds. This is a chart that just shows the antibody levels. And BVD too really does stimulate a great antibody response. But you can see Cattle Master, even though it's a combination, we treat it kind of like a killed vaccine, but their IBR in there is a heat sensitive. It isn't actually killed, but it does behave that way. And you can see the antibody response to Cattle Master. You see the antibody response to Virus Shield, and you see the antibody response to Triangle. So we see that Virus Shield, or that Cattle Master and Triangle had a kind of better antibody response. And this is important to look at here. At day 42, the antibody response to Cattle Master was actually lower than day 72. And in Triangle on day 42, it was higher. And this is very common. We see this a lot. When we look at antibody titers, they are typically all over the place. So all of our animals respond to these vaccines differently, individually and as a group. When we look at BVD type 2, we see a higher antibody response in a similar pattern, high-low, and in a high-low, or declining response. I keep hitting the wrong button. So this was the study where they vaccinated, they bred them, and then they exposed them. And I'm not going to go into great detail on this. You can look at, but the take-home lesson here is that killed virus vaccine program by itself is not adequate. In the Cattle Master, okay, the blue ones are normal calves. The red is the BVD abortions. The green is the calves born alive, but they're BVD infected. And then the purple are the ones that are born with that congenital defect called cerebellar aplasia, or lack of brain development. And so Virus Shield had a few normal, Triangle had a few more normal, Cattle Master had about a 55% of those calves were born normal. And then the controls there was nothing normal. So this is good information for 2 reasons. One, we need to be serious about BVD. BVD causes some serious problems in our herds. 2, this study had a tremendous exposure. And even though this was probably a greater exposure than my herd or your herd will ever see, it's very important to understand that I need to take BVD protection very important, very seriously, and make sure that I have got a good vaccination program to deal with BVD. Courtney, do we want to take that one question in the Q&A or just wait till the end?
Sure. Yeah. So are you talking about Tiffany's question?
Well, it just popped up that there was something came up in Q&A, so I hadn't actually looked at it.
Oh, okay. Well, the question is, are you saying that we need to alternate live and killed virus vaccines or only use live?
If Tiffany, if you can hold that one, I'm going to get to it, because I thank you for that, because that's a great segue into where I'm going. But yeah, I'm going that direction, Tiffany. So and then it just said, what was the environment for the cows in the study? This would be a typical environment. I mean, these cattle were well vaccinated with a good nutrition program, and the environment would have been introducing the PI calves on this study. You can see here that the PIs were actually introduced, but these animals would have been a pretty typical management program in the Southeast, which would have been Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee included that. So hopefully that answers that, but it was here in the Southeast. All right, so another study that Dr. Walls and his group looked at, this is going to go to Tiffany's question, looked at comparing the different vaccinations and then the annual vaccine or the annual revaccination with a different vaccine. And rather than get into the deep details of this, let's just look here at this diagram. So all these animals, except for the control group, all the animals received modified live virus vaccine. They received it here as heifers, and then again pre-breeding. So they got 2 doses of modified live as heifers, then they were bred, then they calved, and then that's when the animals were divided. So the animals had received previously a modified live, everybody, and then they were separated. Some received the modified live, some received that combination vaccine, which acts like the killed. All right, and then the control group, they only receive saline. We have to have a control group that's not protected to make sure that our challenge is always proven effective. They calved them out again, then they rebred them, and then they exposed them to BVD. Then they revaccinated the same way with either the modified live, for those that only got modified live, or those that got the combination, got boosted with the combination. All right, then they were exposed to IBR, and then they were watched for calving or abortion. And this is what happened. So when it came to BVD, this group that only got modified live, 3 abortions, and the rest calved normally. One of those was a BVD positive. But look here in the group that had the modified live topped off with the killed. They did have an abortion, but that abortion was neither IBR nor BVD positive. It was from some other cause. So it wasn't caused by the exposure, but everybody else calved normally. If you look here at the modified live, we had 2 abortions that were IBR positive, okay? None of them were positive in the modified live plus the combination. But look at our control group. Nothing was normal. This just indicates a tremendous over-the-top kind of exposure that really most of our herds are never going to see. But you look at, and this next slide actually, before I get to that, I want to point this out. Look at the antibody response. All of these animals were on, except for the control, that's the green line at the very bottom. All of these animals were on modified live. Antibody levels weren't that impressive. But when I come in here with the combination on top of my modified live, look at that antibody spike. That's impressive. And so if I start with a modified live, come in with killed, look at my antibody protection. Remember, if we got, God gave us two immune, two parts of our immune system, right? We want both parts working for us. So it's really important to understand that I want to stimulate both parts, and that other approach with modified live and then the combination following did just that. So this is another, but you look here at the animals that calve normally in that second group, I got 22 out of 23, 96%. Man, they flew right on through in the face of extreme challenge, no problem. Whereas I had issues, obviously control group, it was 100% disaster. But the group A group, even though we've always thought modified live was a great vaccination program, it did not stand up to it. Yes, 87% of my animals, but if I can get 96%, that's going to be a lot better. So this study was done 20 years ago, but for some reason, we just haven't really applied this information. So what these researchers did is they looked at a couple of different approaches. They looked at killed followed by killed. This is pre-weaning and then at weaning. Day 21 is weaning. They looked at killed followed by modified live. They looked at modified live followed by modified live. Then they looked at modified live followed by the killed. Or they started at weaning and then they followed up 21 days later with their second dose. So let's look at the antibody response to that. If you look here at the animals that were vaccinated pre-weaning and then weaning, if you look at killed and killed, you do see a response, but not that tremendously. But what about the animals that got the killed followed by the modified live? We see some pretty high numbers. This is BVD, and BVD stimulates the immune system strong. We see some pretty high numbers. Modified live, pretty decent response right here to the BVD. So I'm pretty happy with that. Even modified live followed by killed, really good numbers right here. I'm really happy with that. But if we look here at starting our vaccination program at weaning and later, look at my comparisons. Killed, lower. Killed modified live, much lower. So we're seeing, so stress matters. This not only illustrates the benefits of using products in combination, or one right after the other, one later, but it also look at the stress. Our stress group they had a lower response. So our vaccination program, when we can vaccinate those calves, kick them right out back with mama so that their stress levels decline quickly, we get a better overall response. So that makes me think right here that, well, I can use modified live or modified live for BVD. Look over here at this other chart and compare to IBR. IBR doesn't stimulate the immune system the same way. So look here, modified live, much lower antibody response. Whereas if I use killed followed by modified live, I do get a better antibody response. Or if I use modified live followed by killed. And then you get the same effect if I wait until weaning, then I get a delayed response even more. So this is really important for two things. One, I need to think about giving the modified live followed by the killed, or the killed followed by modified live. If I'm vaccinating cows that haven't been vaccinated with a modified live, I need to start with killed, and then I can come back with the modified live at weaning. But I also need to do that on the cow, because those calves are going to have a better overall immune response. So when I initiate my vaccination program matters. And that's very important. This study does a tremendous job of illustrating that. So now we're going to get to the meat of maybe why you joined us. So we've heard a lot that vaccinating with a modified live decreases conception rates. And in this study, conception rates to AI were actually greater in the killed or the combination inactivated group compared to the modified live. This was Dr. Perry and his researchers out of South Dakota. They showed that modified live vaccinating prior to AI reduces my AI conception rate. And it does appear that it does. Overall, pregnancy success actually had no response. But there is a short-term infertility caused by the modified live. So let's look at that chart. And this is a very busy chart, but I want to show it to you and all the data that was actually shown. And then they compared each group. They looked at the seasonal comparison as well as the AI. And so each pair, if you will, each group is represented here. Let me break this down for you just a little bit. Let's look at heifers, because we've got heifers, we've got 2-year-olds, then we've got the adult cattle represented by everything 3 to 13 years of age. So in our heifers, if we look at the summary of all of our heifers, now remember in this study, and I didn't point this out in the previous slide, our heifers got vaccinated at 60 to 75 days before breeding, and then again at 30-ish days, 28, 27. You can see in this group up here, it was 27 days, and in this group was 33. So there's a little variation, but that was the second dose. And that's important to understand that. In our heifers, we didn't see a decline. As a matter of fact, we saw an advantage to modified live, vaccinating our heifers with a modified live, 2 doses with the last one given even 30 days before breeding. We saw an advantage on our AI conception rates, and we saw an advantage in the overall. And we see this advantage overall in almost every group except for this one down here at the very bottom. We saw actually a disadvantage with modified live, but look here. This was our AI success rate, and that's pretty pathetic to begin with. So something was going on with that group that we don't know about. But when we look at our heifers, and they're the easiest to manage. I don't have to sort my calves, and I can vaccinate them when I want. I'm not dealing with postpartum, days postpartum interval, and all that kind of stuff. So my heifers, that's easy to do. There's no excuse that we not vaccinating our heifers with 2 doses of modified live. And just look at the benefits. Okay, this one's already paying me back immediately. What about our 2-year-olds? There's 2 groups of 2-year-olds. We see a reduction in our AI response in our 2-year-olds. But look here at the end of the season, it flip-flops. My infertility is short-lived. That cow's infertility, the modified live, is short-lived. At some point in time, actually the fertility swaps and goes the other way. So this is important to understand. But I think we can get some benefits to our modified live if we bring it in earlier in that animal's life. And let's look at the adult cattle. A similar response, slightly declined on our AI response, but again, the modified live overall pregnancy rate in our overall breeding season is still superior. So I still get the benefits. So in summary, we saw no negative impact on AI or the season for heifers, period. That's probably because it was the second vaccine dose given about 30 days prior to AI. And then the modified live vaccine did reduce the AI conception rate or the early fertility in lactating cows, even vaccinated less than 45 days. What does the label say? 30 days. We still saw an impact at 45 days. Vaccination effects might be a combination of things. Days postpartum. We know that animal's challenged in the first 3 to 4 weeks after calving. I've got involution. I've got negative energy balance. I got all kinds. Remember that curve that I showed about the nutrients, where we don't know where those animals are. And then that curve is going to be delayed and deepened depending on vaccination. But the overall pregnancy rate not only appears to catch up, but is even past, and it's actually superior for modified live vaccines. So just to recap, modified live vaccines provide a stronger, quicker, longer immunity with some cross protection to other strains. Studies demonstrate a superior protection of modified live and the combination modified live inactivated vaccines and preventive programs. Modified lives really need to be considered in a herd health program for calves and replacement heifers. And then vaccination programs can be designed to maximize immunity and minimize risk. Even though I'm recapping, I'm not actually done here, but we've got a few more slides to go. But they may cause a transient reduction in fertility early in the breeding season, even if administered according to the label 30 days prior to breeding. So what's my solution? Well, Why don't I just vaccinate my calves with modified lives and my cows with inactivated? That all the research indicates that's a really good strategy. But remember that doggone label. The label says, and this is from Bovishield, do not use in pregnant cattle. Abortions can result unless they are vaccinated according to label directions with any Bovishield or PregGuard Gold product within the last 12 months, not in their lifetime, but in the last 12 months. Do not use in calves nursing pregnant cows unless their dams were vaccinated within the last 12 months. And why? Because ensure safety in pregnant cattle, heifers must receive 2 doses of Bovishield and vaccinate with the second dose. The strategy, while logical, vaccinating calves with, is clearly off label. So what is the risk? According to label, the risk is herpes virus shedding or risk of BVD fetal infection. So what is the reality of that risk? Remember this vaccination study. These animals were used modified live way back when. Then they switched over either modified live or combination. Then they were exposed, an extreme exposure, but the ones that had the modified live foundation followed by the combination virus vaccine had not only extreme exposure, but their protection was up to the challenge. And that was a natural, virulent, powerful exposure, not a small vaccine shedding challenge. So if their vaccination protection is up to a severe challenge, it's probably up to a slight challenge if there is such thing as a viral vaccine shedding. Is there viral vaccine shedding? The short answer is yes, it is possible, but that risk is very low. All right, so shedding of BHV1, BVD1 and 2 was either non-existent and undetected and did not result in the risk of transmission of BHV. One great study in JAVMA, Journal of American Veterinary Medical Association. None of the contact control animals. So there had sentinel animals that were placed in here. Vaccine virus was not shed to susceptible herd mates. Sentinel animals remained seronegative. Shedding did not occur in these studies, but this one report says, yes, it is possible. What about other studies? You know, the isolation of virus closely related to modified live suggests a concern should be raised about modified live vaccines remaining latent. Okay, this is important to understand. Okay, and or continuing to circulate within the herd even after vaccinations has ceased. And this case from North Dakota showed an abortion following calves nursing pregnant cows. The cows weren't vaccinated. So shedding could cause an abortion in cows that weren't vaccinated. So it's important to understand that if shedding occurs from calves, cows need protection. And then there are treatment differences. So this study actually used dexamethasone injections to mimic stress in like newly received calves. And so they were actually able to isolate BVD. And if IBR and BVD recovered from the nasal swab specimens of vaccine origin in stressed high-risk calves. So that's one of our risk factors. Highly stressed, high-risk calves can shed this vaccine. And then no detectable transmission of either vaccine virus to susceptible contact cattle. So the same person that said that that's a concern, same researcher comes back and looks at some of the risk factors. So shedding, yes, it's possible, but there's risk factors. And that's what? Nutrition and stress. So it's very important to understand that if I'm adequately managing that, then I'm going to reduce the risk of shedding. So is using modified live virus bovine herpes vaccine in my herd risky or not? Well, it's complicated. I'm going to summarize, and now I am getting toward the end. So use of modified live in postpartum or pregnant cows does have risk. There is a risk of a transient infertility. there is a risk of pregnancy loss in last trimester. This risk is probably due to direct effects of the vaccine on ovaries or fetus, or through indirect effects on management, nutrition, or environmental stressors. It depends on immune status. The risk of modified live on fertility might also be mitigated through best management practices. And then previous vaccination with the same modified live is critical. It's crucial. As long as the proper conditions, vaccinating healthy animals in a good nutrition program. But to be honest with you, whether I should use modified live pre-breeding or not, it's probably a moot point. Why? Okay, since it creates logistical challenges, because think about my calving. All my cows, are they going to calve at the same time? No. Most people have a 90 to 120 day or a year-round 12-month breeding season. So all of the cattle are not going to be at the same status regardless. And I might have to come in and vaccinate multiple groups of cows. And we know that is not going to happen. That is not convenient. Most of our people aren't vaccinating, period, because it's inconvenient. So anything that I would adding to the inconvenience is going to reduce vaccine use. So quite frankly, it's going to be prudent to actually look at a killed viral vaccine in lactating cows versus a modified live. It is effective. The research, the scientific studies proves that it protects the fetus and it enhances colostrum. It is safe. It is convenient. It passes the triple test, right? So if I've got a good program, and Tiffany, this goes to your question, if I've got a good program with a modified live, I can switch over to killed and I can receive the best of both worlds. So vaccinating nursing calves, or vaccinating calves nursing pregnant cows that haven't been vaccinated, it is off label. It is off label, and that needs to be discussed with the vaccine, with the owner and the veterinarian or whoever's making the vaccination recommendations. And we need to do everything possible to make sure that we're getting best protection from our vaccination program. So the risk of healthy calves shedding virus is very, very low. It is possible, but it's dang near negligible. Healthy cows previously vaccinated with a modified live, followed by a killed virus vaccine, appears to protect the pregnant fetus from abortion or becoming a PI. How long this protection lasts, we don't know. In that one study, it was a couple of years, but that study hasn't been done. So theoretically, previous vaccination followed by the killed virus should be protective, but it's the same vaccine. There's no research that tells me that using different combinations and different vaccines, companies, all that kind of stuff, there's no research that tells me I'm on solid ground with that recommendation. The actual research doesn't exist. I hear some people are developing those studies, but no company is going to use their vaccine and another company's vaccine and report it if it's the same kind of protection. So the best approach may be to get 3 doses of modified live and replacement heifers pre-breeding, with the last given at 30 days prior to breeding. Not all cattle respond, so 1 dose is not going to get it done. Killed vaccines in pregnant or nursing cows previously vaccinated with a modified live appears to be protective and safe. Maybe I can start the killed vaccination program at preg check. Okay, and then I avoid the postpartum effects of vaccines, especially in my first calf heifers. And so this is important. The managers and owners are advised to manage herds to optimize vaccine response. And the safety of a modified live vaccine program really is up to the herd owner and your veterinarian. So with that, I also want to just kind of point this back out to you. I know that I'm running right up against time, but hopefully it's been informative, and looks like we got a few questions in the Q&A.
Yeah, we do have a few questions, and I sent a chat. If you need to jump off, feel free. I'm just going to ask a few questions before we wrap up. But awesome presentation, a lot of really good information.
Thank you.
Yeah, we have a few good questions, so I'll just ask you a couple of them. As far as when a calf is born, do you want to comment on timing of vaccines or what's too early or start?
Yeah, so Alan, I could go into a vaccination program that is probably longer than the presentation I just gave, but can you vaccinate calves too young? We do know that some of our vaccines still stimulate the immune system despite a very robust maternal immunity. So our concern is, are we vaccinating in the face of a maternal immunity and we're not getting benefit of our vaccine, and we're actually depleting our maternal immunity. But yes, some of our vaccines do a really good job. And I do think 7-way vaccine is probably one of those things that most of our calves are going to be exposed to the Clostridial bacteria. But you can vaccinate too young, but it really depends on the vaccine, because a lot of our visit with your veterinarian and visit with your vaccine representative, because some of our products do show benefits even in calves as young as a month of age. So we can still get there, but it's vaccine dependent. You just want me to go down the list, Courtney?
Yeah, you can see those. You can see those questions too, and you're doing awesome. So you can go through and whichever ones you want to answer. If there's something you don't want to comment, just whatever.
Yeah, well, I maybe not be very smart, so sometimes I dive right into a question I probably have no business answer or get myself in trouble. But I've been in practice and working with cattle for 40 years, so some of this is from experience. And so, what's the estimated? What's the estimated cost per year per cow for a correct vaccination program? Coordinated vaccines, it varies. We're looking at our calfhood vaccination program. If we're looking at 3 rounds of modified live, they're about $1.50 a piece. Plus, let's allow 75 cents for, you're looking at your calf vaccination program is probably going to be in the order of $7 or $8. And it depends on how you're selling your calves. Some of them, like manhemia, and that again is going to be tailored, as you mentioned, Joseph. But and then as far as the cow herd, you're probably looking at anywhere from, it depends on if you add Scour's vaccine in there, which can be expensive, and getting them up to par in our first calf heifers is pricey. But you're looking in the neighborhood of $5 to $10 typically. Vaccines as a whole are some of the cheapest insurance we can buy in our herds, and they pay back dividends way above what they cost. If you and then, are there any studies in progress on mRNA vaccines? Yes, there are studies, and you can look at mRNA vaccines in our swine herds. But there are some studies out there, but I'm not aware of any that are available right now. If you're not sure if cows are vaccinated with modified live, would you just swap to a one-time dose of modified when the cow has received? This is a little bit challenge. I do work with a lot of herds that have had a inconsistent vaccination history, and if you're buying cattle, if you don't know the pregnancy status, then find out, and then you know how to vaccinate that animal. If having a modified live, getting integrated into your program is important, and you can vaccinate newly purchased cattle and they're open or nursing calves, that's a good time to go ahead and get them on the modified live, knowing, of course, that it's possible. If you got to give that second dose, you may push it against fertility. But if everything else, body condition, otherwise nutrition is otherwise good, you might be able to get away with that transient infertility, and then the animal's going to come back and then be part of the healthy herd from that point. But there's several different strategies, Tiffany, and no one is absolutely better than the other. And that's and I do work with different herds, and they've all got different strategies or kind of slight differences in some of those strategies.
Yeah. One last quick question that we had come through on the chat. A lot of people might not have just noticed this on the labels, but how do you know which vaccines are the modified live versus the killed?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. So modified lives typically require mixing, but there's a combination that also Cattle Master, I'll just mention it. Cattle Master also requires mixing. Cattle Master falls into the combination. We treat it like killed, but our modified lives like Triangle, it doesn't take any mixing whatsoever. That's a kill. Virus Shield is a kill. So if it doesn't take any mixing whatsoever, it is a killed product. The ones that require mixing have a modified live or a modified live component. And then also, obviously, if you read the label, it will say down on the bottom that it's either inactivated or modified live, or which components are which.
Yeah. Well, with that, Dr. Jones, I think we'll conclude this webinar. Again, we really appreciate you speaking with us. Awesome presentation. I think a lot of people probably got a lot of good stuff to take back to their herds and implement in their management. So thank you.
Thank you, Courtney. Appreciate being part of the program.
Absolutely. Everybody have a good rest of your day.
Bye.